Well, welcome everybody. Please get settled in. You are at the road session. I'll give it another minute here just for folks to get settled in. All right, welcome. My name is David Lipsetz. I'm the CEO of the Housing Assistance Council. Thank you so much for joining today's session. This is what capacity looks like, building development muscle in rural and native nation communities. I'm attending today here from the ancestral land of the Notachtank and Piscataway people, on which now mostly is the District of Columbia. And I'm also parachuting in from our National Rural Housing Conference, which is going on concurrently, which is a couple of days of networking and training and idea sharing. Invite folks over to that as well. As we look at today's event, I want to make a big point of thanking all the partners who are involved. There are 5 of us. The Rural Opportunity Development Series is the sessions we're doing, and the 5 national groups that are doing our best to foster prosperous rural communities include the Federal Reserve Board, Aspen Institute's Community Strategies Group, Rural LISC, Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and my organization, of course, Housing Assistance Council. And also, just as a quick FYI, HAC and the other session partners are featured in a new book called Investing in Rural Prosperity. It's compiled by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. Hopefully you can see a link going into the chat where you can download it or get a free copy sent to you by the Fed. All right, so roads. What do we do with the roads series? Next slide. All right, so we are highlighting and unpacking rural development ideas and strategies. The series launched in the middle, or as the early days of the pandemic started to look like long days, and we knew that community organizations were struggling to be able to find their way through to do their work in this time. We also have a strong eye focused on the long-term recovery for rural America. So what did we think we could do for that kind of thing? Well, lifting up local practitioners so that they can share what works, lift up a diverse set of voices, experiences from across all of rural America, trying to highlight what works, trying to identify challenges that we'll have to deal with as an industry, but mostly to build a network of organizations so that we have peers, people we can communicate with, share our ideas, and find prosperity in vibrant rural communities together. All right, so today's event, it's a moderated panel. You've got a discussion that goes from now up until 4:30 Eastern. After the panel, there'll be breakout rooms where you can drop in, an opportunity to bring your best practices, share your ideas, ask questions. The panelists will be there. You'll be able to go between rooms, and we really are looking for that as our opportunity to grow this dialogue, get as much information collected, and be able to build that community of organizations. It ain't easy in rural places, and we need each other throughout this process. So looking forward to your engagement there. We do, of course, want you to be active before that even. Hopefully you've seen a couple of things go by in the chat box. Share your insights there, your thoughts with fellow attendees. If you want to drop your name in there and say, hey, I hail from Immokalee, Florida. I'm doing farm worker work down here, or anything like that. Get that dialogue going. There's also a Q&A box for those of you a little less familiar with Zoom calls that you can ask specific questions of the speakers or moderators. You find that on your menu bar. And of course, because nothing can be done in just one layer, as we all sit in our attics and our houses, and well, I'm at the office today, but it's fairly empty. We want you to be on social media as well. If you're hearing things in this conversation that you want to be able to share with your networks and your peers, hashtag rural innovation, hashtag road session, grab these. You see them listed here. The groups as well, all of our links from Twitter and LinkedIn. Get those online, get the conversation even broader for those who can't be here in attendance today. All right, so, and lastly, before we dig in, I guess at the end of the panel discussion, you can join those breakout sessions by clicking a link will show up in the chat box or in the email that you got earlier today. If you haven't received that email, please send a note in to the csg.program@aspeninstitute.org. You can see it right there on the slide. In a few days, all the registered attendees will receive a link. So you'll have a recording of the panel discussion and you can follow up. You'll have contact information and you'll be able to see this information even as you need to refer back to it later. So, and with that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's moderator, a dear friend of mine, Janet Topolsky. For 4 decades, Janet has helped community leaders, organizations, and policymakers all across the country find, create, spread development strategies, and those that work. At Aspen since 1993, Janet has specialized in peer learning design and facilitation, family asset building. She loves to say doing economic development differently, the connecting of low wealth, rural, and urban communities into regional economic development strategies, leading to better livelihoods, and taking a good focus on community development philanthropy, where we're building the capacity of place-rooted foundations to improve local economies. So a moment's privilege here, because as some of you may know, Janet has announced that she'll be retiring at the end of this year. So while she's leaving Aspen Community Solutions Group in good hands with Chris Estes and Bonita Robertson-Hardy, she's going to be greatly missed. Janet, in your career, you've helped literally thousands of communities that are home to millions of people. I'm proud to call you a colleague and friend and wish you all the best. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Don't start me that way. But thank you. Hey, listen, first of all, just a quick plug for the book that David mentioned, because he wrote a chapter and I wrote a chapter, and that's another way you can look at it. But I'm just delighted to be here. I'm delighted to once again join to moderate a panel as part of these road sessions with my good 5 organization or other 4 organization colleagues. And, you know, what we're going to talk about today is capacity. Now, everyone's talking about capacity, all right. You know, this is not a new thing, right? Back when I started at Aspen CSG back in 1993, there was this new term in the field called community capacity building. Like, people started using the term, no one knew what it meant. So we had a whole group that met for 3 years to define what is community capacity building. And actually, we published a workbook on measuring community capacity building, and Devin's going to put the link for that in the chat, and you'll be able to find it on the resource page for this. But it's still a pretty darn interesting little workbook that talks about what is community capacity in this case, and how can you measure it? What's a menu of measurement? So I just sort of say some things are out there that aren't being used, so I'll just put in a plug for that right now. But I mean, you know, we titled this, Tell Me What Capacity Looks Like. It's sort of like when you're in a march and a protest, tell me what capacity looks like. This is what capacity looks like. So we have an embarrassment. I don't think we have an embarrassment of riches. I think we have the typical wonderful rural development hero riches here with us today. And so we're going to start by having a conversation with 3 terrific human beings and rural cognoscente. Miriam Jorgensen is research director with the Native Nations Institute, which is the University of Arizona. She's also the Harvard Project. She's with the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, but she's in St. Louis, Missouri. So you can put all that together and figure it out. Shantaria Charleston is the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with our colleague organization, the Housing Assistance Council. And she comes at capacity building from each one of these comes at capacity building, or what is capacity, from a different angle. And so that's great. And finally, we have an on-the-ground rural development action hero, Cheryl Lee Hills, who's executive director of the Region 5 Development Commission, which is an economic development district headquartered in Staples, Minnesota. So I'm happy to have all of them, and we're going to jump right into this conversation. That's what we're going to do. We're going to have a conversation. We'll be joined later by one other terrific human being. So what I really wanted to do is just give you all a little context from, or have each of the speakers give you a little context about where they're coming from when it comes to thinking about capacity. So first of all, just very quickly, Shantaria, would you talk to us a little bit about, some context basics about your rural place or the type of rural communities you work with, or in what context you work with them?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. The Housing Assistance Council, as a national technical assistance intermediary and CDFI, we maintain a national focus solely on addressing the housing challenges across rural America. We have special emphasis areas that include high needs groups and regions, including Indian country in particular, the Mississippi Delta, farm workers, the southwest border colonias, Appalachia, and then we also focus some of our capacity building efforts on veterans. And so looking at capacity building, we look at it from the perspective of housing development, and then because we are a CDFI and lending institution, we also look at it from a borrower's perspective, making sure that nonprofit organizations have good capacity to become borrowers that then help and assist their programs around housing development.
All right, don't define capacity yet. I just want to know the context in which you're working. Gotcha. So Cheryl, can you offer that?
Hi, Janet. Sure. I hail from central Minnesota. As Janet said, 5 counties we serve, so 155 townships and 65 cities, very rural. Largest community is about 13,000, and a lot of small towns. And like Shantaria, some of the populations we serve are veteran populations, are low income, BIPOC community populations, a lot of low income folks in the region. And we do hail from the land of Chippewa tribes and Ojibwa people. And so we focus very intentionally on how we can deliver services, community development and economic development services. So yes, lending, but a lot more planning and implementation of community development projects as well.
Thanks. And Miriam, what do you consider your rural place, where you focus your work?
So I consider my rural place to be essentially the entirety of Indian country. And that technically defined is the 57 million acres that are held in trust by the US government for tribes and Native nations. But it includes lands beyond that as well, or amongst that, perhaps, is a better way of saying it, because tribes don't actually hold in an ownership sense all the land on their reservations because of the history of land takings, and allotment is, maybe one of the more recent of those policies. So we think of Indian country as kind of lands that are on and near reservations. I think one of the important things to think about is that many people kind of think that, oh, American Indians, there aren't very many of those, are there? But this is a population that was about 1% of the US population in 2010, when we're looking at that census statistic of the race alone. And it's 2 or 3% of the population when you look at American Indians in combination with other races. But just that alone population is interesting because a lot of people think that that might be a population that's more likely to live on or near tribal homelands. And it's fascinating to see that in the 2020 census, the early emerging statistics are suggesting that that population increased by almost 30%. So there's 3.7 million American Indians who are identify as American Indian or Alaska Native alone. They're part of 574 federally recognized Native nations and 63 state recognized tribes. Many of those are in Alaska, more than 300 though of the federally recognized tribes, and all of the state recognized tribes are in the lower 48. And I think one last thing I want to leave you with, Janet, is that as you can tell from what Cheryl said, and you can intuit if you know that geography, a lot of these tribes and these lands are in rural areas or in rural and small town areas. There's a statistic that gets tossed around a lot that says 70% of American Indians live in urban areas. But really careful research by the Urban Institute and the First Nations Development Institute reminds us that 67% of the or nearly 70% of the American Indian lone population lived on or near reservation lands in 2010, and a majority of that population lived in rural areas in 2010. So if those population statistics persist into 2020, we're really still talking about rural and rural-ish communities in Native America.
Thanks, Miriam. I want to jump into capacity now because we've got, I think, a pretty good understanding of where each of you is coming from when you think about capacity. So my first question is, when other people talk about capacity, I mean, because we hear this all the time now, rural needs more capacity or blah, 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 capacity, we're low capacity or whatever. I mean, I think people get capacity mixed up with assets, thinking that rural has no assets. And we all know, and I'm just going to set that aside. I don't want to spend time on that. We all know rural is full of assets and has plenty of assets. But the issue, there's some issue that has to do with capacity. So when you hear other people talk about it, what do you think they're talking about? Are they talking about the capacity of people? Are they talking about the capacity of organizations? Are they talking about the capacity of community or something else? What do you think people mean? And don't spend too much time on this, then we want to get into what you mean. But let's first of all go around and say, what do you think people mean when they say capacity? Cheryl, do you have a thought on that?
Yes, all the above. Right, for rural places, it is, yes, it is people, it's organization, it's communities. It's all of that. We sometimes don't understand the nuances and how we separate those, how the people lead into the organizations that lead into the communities that we serve. But yeah, we're talking about all the above, at least from my perspective.
Shantaria?
I would agree. It's all of the above. I think one important thing to note is that capacity looks different depending upon where you are. And so, you could have two different people talking about capacity in two different regions and yet still be talking about two very different things. So like Cheryl said, it's all of the above, but yet it still may not even connect when you're thinking about the two different regions or the two different groups or, those sorts of things.
Yeah, Miriam?
I don't know. Yes, underline everything above. I would simply add, though, that I think a lot of times conversations about capacity boil down to conversations about civil society, and they also boil down to conversations about know-how. And those things are clearly interwoven through organizations, through leadership, through governance, things like that. And I think that we need to remember, underscore really what Shantaria just said about capacity looks different in different places. And in part, that's because the know-how needed to make things done in those places differs.
Mm-hmm. So each of you, I'm sure, has to, in your work, be able to answer the question, well, what is capacity? How do you define capacity? And what would it look like when it happened? Right? So we're in this interesting situation where there's a lot of interest now from funders, from governments in, okay, you say you want to build rural capacity. Tell me what it looks like so we can measure it, right? So how do you, when you're making an argument to strengthen rural capacity, how do you define it when you're talking to someone else? And how would you suggest they measure it? And Cheryl, let's go to you first.
I know that's a loaded question, so I'm just going to touch on a couple little light things first. I think about capacity in a couple ways, where we're doing some bridging work, where we're helping build capacity of groups or organizations and communities. And an example of that might be teaching how to write a competitive application, investment proposals, or teaching them how to do measurement. And then we hand off that project or that program and the local community implements it. Versus the other form of capacity that I define, which is when we're building capacity specifically as an intermediary, where not only do we secure the funding, but we also implement the projects and programs. And that could be, for instance, as an example of that, like lending, access to capital, our lending programs, or being a solar developer or a wind developer of a project in your region, right? So that's actually building capacity. So I think of that as bridging and building, right? And that happens in lots of different ways, obviously. So when we're trying to define it, there's lots of ways that can happen. That's group, one-on-one, peer mentoring, network building, all those things that we do. But I think to Shantaria's point earlier that we talked a little bit about capacity, rural capacity being customized. When I try to give examples to my legislative friends on what does capacity building actually look like from their chair, I talk to them about things like having their federal agencies start to discuss things like distress criteria and or time for building capacity can be extending the time of period of which we need to comply or reply to NOFAs or funding opportunities, or how federal agencies can internalize equity more. And that is also building capacity. Those are ways, Janet, that federal agencies can build. Philanthropy builds capacity a little bit different, but I'm gonna stop there and let my colleagues sort of share a little bit more what they think. But bridging and building are the way I sort of think about the two buckets of the types of capacity that we're doing. And it is customized to every community and based upon their culture. And I want to make sure that's emphasized.
Okay, Shantaria?
Gosh, Cheryl hit upon so many great points. But I would say capacity, just further building upon what Cheryl said, is that capacity is the ability of residents, those key stakeholders, and all involved to create and develop systems that support the community. You know, just like simply put, if I had to just 2-3 words, it's really knowledge paired with resources, and then further implemented into policies and procedures and practices in a community or amongst a group of stakeholders that sort of build and develop and grow the areas around.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you something now. You said, because it's really interesting, you said it's the ability to create systems that sustain the community, right? And so, you know, the ability within people or within organizations, or are you going to tell me again it's tailored? Because I want to support you, but I need a widget to measure. I mean, what am I looking at here?
That's a very good question. From my early years getting into housing, I've always told people, you know, really capacity starts with the individual, and then it's transferred into the organization through those systems that are structured and the policies that are then developed. And so if you look at it, an organization is just an organization until you get the right people in place to sort of, you know, implement and structure things out. So for me, it's one thing that builds upon another. And so it starts with the capacity of the individuals that are in those places and in those spaces and organizations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Miriam, what do you want to add to this?
I think it's fascinating to listen to both Shantaria and Cheryl talk about capacity in rural areas in ways that's just a little bit broader than I might talk about capacity in Native communities, which has a sort of particular flavor. But if you could literally reel back the tape and hear what Shantaria was talking about that had to do with organizations and governance capacity and meeting goals set for themselves and thinking about sustainability, to me, that lines up a lot with something that I think is 30 years of research in Indian country demonstrate as capacity for Native nations, which is this notion of Native nation building, that nations have capacity when they demonstrate a capacity to exercise their sovereignty and to back up those sovereign desires with governance, and that's both governance institutions that might be both public government, but also sort of those organs of civil society that can help them accomplish those things and that have cultural appropriateness in their communities for accomplishing those self-determined goals. And then that sustainability idea that they're not just about, you know, solving the problem of the now, but thinking about that long term and how is this community, how is this tribal nation going to address those issues into the future, and that's complemented by leaders across the sectors, from elected political leadership to organizational leadership to grassroots and youth leadership and spiritual leadership that are focused on helping the community get those things done. So literally, that's an evidence-based model that says Native nations that have those attributes are the ones that are actually achieving their goals. And so
could you repeat what the attributes are again?
So asserting sovereignty, backing up that sovereignty with effective institutions. And those institutions also have to have cultural legitimacy or cultural match. A focus on the long term, not just a focus on the short term problems of the day, and public spirited, nation building focused leaders from across the spectrum who are helping the community along that pathway toward its goals. And so to me, that points out that if I were to measure capacity, you get to these kind of customized measures, but I have this kind of economics definition of measuring it, which is if a community set a goal for itself, if it's moving along the pathway toward that goal or has achieved that goal, that's revealed that it has capacity. So that's that kind of functional definition that you have capacity if you demonstrate that you did something. But I think there's some shorter term markers of that. It is things like, do you have in a tribal nation a stable political leadership structure that's not, tearing itself apart, but that has smooth turnover and can sustain goals over time? Do you have an ability to partner with other entities, be those other organizations like philanthropies or non-native governments? So those are markers, those are measures of capacity. But I think best of all, though, capacity, I come back to this notion of that it's told through the story of what communities are able to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. So what's different, about rural, right? So if we say, okay, so, because there are these, whether we do them ourselves or other people do them and we don't want them to, they say, well, rural has X capacity compared to urban. I mean, what do you think, and I don't know what the X, it could be more, it could be less, but what do you think is the rural capacity challenge or the rural capacity advantage? Any of you?
I want to riff a little bit, Jen, on what Miriam said, and it will answer some of your question too about what's different about rural in that, and when we measure success in capacity building, it isn't necessarily just the outputs or the outcomes. And that's important for us in rural. It's also about, it's taking that plan, do, learn, adjust, that cyclical approach of plan, do, learn, adjust, but it's that intellectual and cultural and social capital that's also established while we're doing and achieving those outputs and outcomes. So yeah, capacity building is the ability to get stuff done, but it is also that process that she was talking about, the plan, do, learn, adjust, and the storytelling that is really, really important for rural places. And I think what differentiates rural, at least from my perspective, is that the scale. One, there's this issue of scale, and that our rural places, we know and we have a sense of responsibility, at least in the rural places I've worked in and been able to be with, that we carry that awesome responsibility about access to water and energy and food. And so we know that, and we're not as able to work in silos because each of those areas completely influence each other. I like to say they're completely umbilical cord connected. And what I mean by that is that we can't necessarily just build financial capacity without building environmental stewardship, without building social capacity, because that three-legged stool doesn't stand without all three legs, right? So what also differentiates rural in that space is that there are finite resources to burn. So when we don't do something right, or we start to fumble in our capacity building, like we're not paying attention to those that are not participating in the systems that we're trying to impact, or inequities are getting in the way, that we burn relationships and we burn opportunities for the future. And this work is foundationally built on relationships and trust. Capacity building is built through those two areas. And if we burn that trust in rural places, we can't go to another community of 50,000 people to another end of the urban region. So we end up having to make sure that we intentionally tend to those relationships so that trust stays strong, because rebuilding it takes generations.
So on some level, I think I hear you saying, and go ahead and comment on Shantari and Miriam, that the cycle of actually getting something done, right, actually in some way states that a relationship has been built, because it couldn't have been done otherwise, and therefore it sets up higher capacity or sort of a trusting relationship, which is in and of itself higher capacity, and gives you a different starting point for the next thing that you do. Makes it more likely you'll be able to do more later or do greater later, huh?
Yeah, and I'll jump in with that, Janet. The story that I described, or the research that I described about what's called Native nation building, is about tribes. It's about Native communities living in Native homelands and how they're accomplishing things for themselves on their self-determined pathway. So that's within, if you will, the silo of Native nationhood. What Cheryl's describing can also take place within the silo of rural communities. But what gets really exciting, and I think is part of the uniqueness of rural America, is that there's a much greater opportunity for these two worlds to cross and to then have a flowering and more expansive and better outcome coming from that. That there's, if you will, greater capacity then when these two worlds meet. So often, though, they don't. And I think that that's one of the things that is unfortunate about rural development right now, is that we have this ongoing situation where in many rural areas, there's a tribal community and it operates in almost the absence of engagement of or more substantive engagement with non-Native communities nearby or surrounding it. And that, that's kind of like leaving money on the ground. That's kind of like sort of walking past, the $20 bill that's lying on the ground and saying, oh, I'm not going to pick that up. But rather, if you kind of pick up that bill and that happens through this relationship building, you actually are able to do more with it. But relationship building between Native and non-Native communities is not, simple, and it can't be necessarily legislated out of the blocks. It has to start right where Shantaria took us earlier, which is at the individual level, building those individual personal relationships that are real and authentic relationships, bumping those up then to the organizational relationships and the governance relationships, and finding ways to invest in those relationships over time. Because as Cheryl pointed out, when you lose those things, that capacity is gone and you've just wasted it.
Mm-hmm. Shantaria, did you want to add anything to this?
I do want to add something really quickly, because Miriam hit on something when she talked about the flowering relationships. And so that struck me as rather poignant, because as I think about what's different in rural, it is really, if you put a rose in fertile soil and you water it, it'll grow. But if you put a rose, you bury it in concrete, those things typically tend to die. And so when you think about the capacity and the tenacity of folks in rural areas, how they just continue to strive against all odds and then create like these wonderful housing developments, and they create creative, really innovative programs, like those are some of the things that are different in rural America. Not that that's not happening in urban places and spaces, but it's really easy to create good products and innovative solutions in an area that's already rich with resources and capacity. But to do that in a space where none of that exists, that is really like the thing that sort of sets, for me, in my opinion, that sets rural places and people that are operating in those places apart from others.
So none of you have said, okay, capacity, what we need for capacity is money, right? And I mean, this is quite interesting because, it's like, give us more money is what a lot of people say, then we'll have more capacity. So is there a reason you haven't said money, or is there a role for financial resoaces in building capacity?
Well, yeah, it's not that we haven't said money.
Don't all jump in at the same time. Shantaria, go ahead.
It's not that we haven't said money. We're using the code word resources. And so, when you got to use the code word.
Uncode that. Let's code switch to money. How can money help? Is it the amount? Is it the structure of money? Give us, how can that help build capacity in rural?
Money helps in many ways. It's not going to be the end all be all solution. So, I'm not saying that. But in terms of money, like smaller nonprofits and groups that are operating in rural areas, first, they got to keep the lights on and the doors open. And so in that sense, resources, financial resources help. And then also too, making sure that there's appropriate amounts of resources, funding allocated to projects to really make them, to make them happen, and then to make them sustainable. And so I think resources, money, other investments can be really helpful in a number of different ways, but it's not going to be the end all solution.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, send money.
Okay. Sorry.
I mean, it is money, Janet, we're talking about. Sorry, Miriam. I think the approach that we really need to think about is not just the money, as Shantarian said. when I work with philanthropy or with our federal agencies or state agencies, it's also their relationships with them that we're looking for. So, and I mean like relationships where they don't hold the power of the purse without a reciprocal sort of practitioner relationship where I can tell them what's working or not working with their programs as it pertains to delivering services and as an intermediary on the ground. And so, yes, the investments are important, but not just investments into the outputs and the outcomes in terms of the work we're doing, and long-term investments into intermediaries, because some of this work, whether you're talking about climate or you're talking about social change, that takes a long time. And you asked the important question about what to measure on that. The measurements of these things take time. And so you need long-term flexible investments into those intermediaries that were built from people and comprised of people, right, that had also skill development invested in them, so more money. So I think, it is the resources into the intermediaries that are flexible, long-term, but into the people. The work is also taxing. So those doing social or environmental advocacy or housing advocacy or anything for low-income people, that activism is draining. And so I don't want just money into the projects and programs. While I do, I also need the human capital to be invested in so that we don't get to a point to where we are so drained doing this very difficult work that it is taxing on us to the point to where it makes it, the turnover is unbearable for us to sustain the work and have it be financially, the investments be worthwhile through the long run, right? It's not resilient if we don't have those investments be, worthwhile. So those are some areas, hopefully, Janet, that give you some ideas on what more than money we can use, policy changes as well.
That's one way, I've come to think about it. You can do this work for years and then have what I call a BFO, a blinding flash of the obvious, right? And one of those is the predictability of funding is capacity in and of itself. So if you think of a family, families that don't know what their income is going to be from month to month, live from month to month. The same is true of communities and organizations. If all you're getting is project funds and it's a 1-year grant, or something like that, or sort of a contingent investment, you can't plan for the future. You can't hire a human being because you don't know you're going to have that funding going forward. And we don't think a lot about the fact that a lot of rural organizations, especially, I think, are functioning like, low-income families who don't know what their income is going to be, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, and all the energy of the leaders goes into just trying to raise that money as opposed to doing the work. And that's a real issue that we don't talk about. And we certainly don't measure the predictability of funding for these organizations that are doing this hard work in rural places and Native nations. Miriam, did you want to add anything? Then I want to bring in Lynette.
The only thing I'd add is that to build on both what Shantari and Cheryl was saying is that sometimes it's the willingness by a philanthropy or other outside entity to fund the unusual suspect. And in that sense, I think that you're looking at funding for meetings to happen on an ongoing basis to build relationships, funding for a tribal library that is going to serve a broader population and bring broadband resources to that community because it has special access to funds, funding for respite for organizational leaders to go on vacation together and bring them together in a way that's not work related. So those unusual suspects, I think, have the ability to provide the relationship building, to generate greater sustainability, and to build up some of these complementary capital resources that help money be used smartly, wisely, and to last over the long term.
Well, I think we should all stop and read the chat box, which is like going crazy with some really interesting stuff. I can't read it all. And someone just mentioned it's Giving Tuesday, but I want to bring in another voice. Now, I want to bring in Lynette Gilbert. And some of you, I'm sure, have known Lynette over the years. Many of you may have not, but I met Lynette back in about, Lynette, you can put yourself on screen now, by the way. I met Lynette back in about, let me think, 96, 97 or whatever, when she was first hired at the Greater New Orleans Foundation, which is a foundation that covers now, I think, up to 13 parishes, which is what counties are covered there. But when Lynette was hired by the Greater New Orleans Foundation, they were doing no work in rural, and she got hired to do the work in rural for the foundation, to begin some more deep work for the foundation in the rural parts of Southeast Louisiana. She then went on later to serve as Senior Program Officer for Social Justice Philanthropy at the Ford Foundation for a number of years, which is how a lot of people around the country came to know her. And so I wanted Lynette to join this because I've come to know Lynette as someone who like cuts through the crap and gets to the nut of things. And so I wanted to just ask her, and says sort of like simply very simple things that are also brilliant and sort of like, once again, blinding flashes the obvious. So I wanted her just to listen to the beginning of this conversation and just to come in and sort of offer, what are you hearing, or what do you think we're missing, or what challenge, or ask your own questions. So Lynette, what has this raised for you?
Well, it's raised good feelings about hope. First of all, this panel is phenomenal. I can say over the period of time that I worked in rural and urban work, we've had some wise, smart people working at the community level and state level and so on. You guys are at the top of the list. And I salute you for not just your ability to talk about it, but that you really have lived through it. So when you say something, it makes a difference. Now, one of the observations I will make is that I love this, the way you have looked at capacity, because when I started in the field, I thought people had to live in rural, they lived out there because they had to. I found out later on, a lot of people want to live there, but they also need a way to be able to stay there and prosper. And by prospering, I don't just mean money. I mean, their communities have to be growing. They have to feel as though they are invested in those places. So I'm excited about what I'm hearing because you've picked up on that over the years. I will say to you that I love the definitions of capacity. When we started the conversation, I said, so what's changed? That was the question I wrote down here for myself. And what's changed is that we have some real people, unlike myself, who are committed to rural. At the time, I had worked at the foundation for 6 years when Janet found me. And she found me because the director wanted to be a part of a Ford grant that would deal with rural. And rural is really 20 minutes outside of New Orleans in any direction. But we had never really thought about it in that way. So, as I said before, I was expecting really people who just really couldn't do any better. But I found people who loved where they lived. But they also were marginalized in one way. They really didn't understand. They understood how their communities worked, how government worked in their communities, but they couldn't seem to figure out why they weren't benefiting from anything that was happening all around them. Fast forward to the last few years, what I hear you saying is exactly what we're picking up in communities where we're trying to, in Native nations and rural communities, we're finding out that people need to build that trust relationship again. And one thing that you didn't speak to, but that's very real, is that we've got to find a way to help people who live in those places heal. Their families, inside of their families, some of them are so angry with their parents and grandparents. Many of the kids would demonstrate their anger by saying, yes, you're right, Mom. I had to go away to college. Or, yeah, I had to go to Columbus and get a job instead of staying in this little rural place. But that was not about only they're getting ahead. It was about, I can't deal with you. I can't deal with what you've allowed to happen here. And so there's that kind of internal family healing that has to happen. And then within communities, people remember, Cheryl, your dad, the reason that this happened, because your dad fired my dad. Or, Miriam, your mother never did marry. And yet here you are. and now you're trying to be the mayor. You know, so people remember those things, and it's not a good memory, and it doesn't move the community forward when you're stuck in that experience. One of the communities that I invested in heavily was in central Wisconsin, and about the 6th year of the investment, these two little towns just realized that they couldn't get federal monies unless they worked on a grant together. And both of them said separately, I don't like those people. I don't want to work with them. I don't like them. But they couldn't get the money for water improvements and the tower that they needed and whatever unless they worked together. And so finally, there was a wise woman who ran the community foundation there, and she said, let's figure out how we can get over this. And the two of them, those two little communities, wrote a grant. They didn't get the grant for 4 years. They had to keep submitting and resubmitting, which meant they had to keep trusting each other. They had to keep enlarging their vision in order to succeed finally. So some of the things that you're talking about at the end is really what capacity sits on. It sits on trust and relationships and vision. If you can only ever see where your tribe is now located, doing the same thing that they've always done, then chances are there won't be any growth. No one else, if people notice you, it's for development reasons. They want to come over and come in and take over. But if you can see your communities building new waterfronts that end up in creating jobs for kids that live there, for that bring in small businesses or support small businesses, then you can develop the capacity, because you're going to want to sit through that session on how to write the proposal. And you want to go to the county council meeting and say, and this is what we want, and we're not leaving until we get it. I mean, that's real capacity. Right?
So Lynette, if I can just say, at some level, you're saying that there's capacity that needs to be built in the community by the community, right?
Yes.
The capacity does not come from outside, although outsiders can help support the development of capacity, but there has to be work on capacity building within the community as well, in terms of building relationships that will help make things work.
It is, and I want to take a privilege to mention this emergent learning theory. Not that it's new, but I can't remember, her last name is Brown, this young woman who's known for her her writing about supernatural stories. One of the emergent learning theories is that the problem that needs to be addressed, the conversation that needs to happen, can only happen in this room with the people in the room. Now, when you're in rural places, it may not be the room. It may be the conversation that needs to happen can only be addressed by those who are already here. Now, remember, so many people are now moving to rural, right? All of a sudden, the big city lights aren't so great anymore. And some people we've read about who left one part of the country to move to another part of the country that's quieter and smaller. Well, when new people come in, you've got to build some relationships and introduce them to the culture that's there, to the heritage that sustains that place. And then we can talk about who needs houses and what does affordable housing look like in this space. And when we're talking about economic development, then we can start to say, you know, that's a good idea, but let me tell you about these 4 people who have an idea to launch a business that will allow 70 people to be hired in this community. So you're talking about building the capacity to negotiate, to see people as they are. Now, I'm not talking about seeing poor people. I'm talking about seeing people who come to your place with a great idea, and I'm in a new home, and they want to do new things. You have to see them and watch them over time as they see you and watch you over time. You're in a risky place, is what I'm saying. And capacity now requires that kind of sharpness to see, you know, what people are offering you and why all of a sudden this community. All we have is a cemetery and a church 25 houses. That's maybe what you see, but they also see the land behind you. They see the cemetery and the history that goes with the cemetery and becomes a cultural site. So there's so much more that you're offering when you're now talking about capacity. And then being a CDFI, my goodness, that's the greatest thing, since homemade bread. Remember, everybody's going back to homemade bread. But having the capacity to invest, be invested in, but also to invest your own resources in something that you can have a say over, very important.
So, someone just put in the chat, what's a CDFI? It's a community development financial institution. Thank you, Miriam. And I would say that it might be a CDFI. The point is there an organization? Do you have a structure? I mean, so when I think of capacity too, I think of, do you have a structure within which you can work together? That can bring
everyone together. Or can you build
together.
a structure? Or can you
create
that structure?
And if you don't have one, I mean, we call them rural development hubs here at Aspen CSG, but is there an organization? Might be a community foundation, might be a community or tribal college. It could be any number of different organizations, a CDC, could be a chamber of commerce that is really sort of looking at the whole. And I think it was Cheryl who said, we don't have the luxury at rural to work on just one siloed issue because they all affect each other and you see the connections almost immediately in rural. So you really have to work systemically across issues, but you still have a lot of one issue organizations in rural, just as you do in other places. So who's taking on the sort of Swiss Army knife role to bring everyone together to sort of say, okay, let's look at the whole system and figure out what are the pieces that are going to unleash it? And I mean, that's a capacity too,
Yeah, it is a capacity, but it's not just rural. It's not just
a relationship. I totally agree. It's a relationship building capacity. It's an organization that says we've got to build these relationships, right? I remember talking to Bill Bishop, who lives in LaGrange, Texas, who wrote The Big Sort, which talked about how America was sorting itself out. Not in a good way. So everyone's living, near people like them, we're sorting ourselves into zip codes sort of. And he talked about that long before all of that other stuff came out. And it's a great book sometime, read it, The Big Sort. But I talked to him last year and I said, people, keep asking, well, how do we get over these divides in rural? And he said, I'm not going to build relationships by talking about politics. I'm going to build relationships by, figuring out how are we going to take care of the town dump? How are we going to solve the water problem? So it's easier to build relationships around doing something everyone cares about than it is to build relationships around I'm right and you're wrong about X, Y, and Z politics or, whatever it is, state regulation. So, I mean, that's the other thing to think about is that it gets back to the doing, capacity is measured in the doing. Have we accomplished something together? And does that set us up for accomplishing more later? Right?
Oh, can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
And I agree with what you said. It's not even a question. This is another thing that I didn't hear enough about when you guys were talking, and that's youth. See, the capacity, you can build it and lose it when 2 or 3 people who've been running everything and who've been championing other things all of a sudden decide they don't want to be there. But when you're building this way and this way, then you have a chance at people retaining and sustaining what it is that you've developed. So I didn't hear enough about the work that you're doing with young people. I'm talking about young people, I'd say around from 15 to 25, having them be a part of what you're growing. And I love what my good friends did at First Nations, and I love what's happened at the Harvard Institute, for those who get to the graduate level or the college level. But somebody needs to do that youth development work around community development. Now, there used to be in the South a 21st century leadership camp. I'm happy to say that almost all of the young people who went through that camp, and there are hundreds of them, are now doing policy change work. They're either implementing it or they're social entrepreneurs or they're entrepreneurs, but they're doing it. And I say to you, somehow we've got to be sure that we're engaging these young people around the vision and around the policies that it will take to create the vision. So thank you.
All right, so that's another measurement maybe of capacity. How are the youth involved and in what ways? I want to throw in one question from the Q&A box. I know there's some questions in chat, but I'm just looking at the Q&A box. From Ellen Firth, who said, I'm thinking about the impact of change, the broad dynamic on rural communities and the individuals who live within them. Change can be such a destabilizer in rural communities. There's also the prevalence of hope, initiative, and ambition not being matched with long-haul survive and thrive capacities and competencies. Failures linger on our rural landscapes. How does that fit into the conversation? Is there a capacity that can get you past that memory of failure or some of the, relationship stuff that Lynette was talking about? Any thoughts on that?
So I think it's a lot about putting on the magic apron and getting in the kitchen and cooking together, right? And figuring out each other's styles and learning about each other's cultures while you do that. And yes, that engages youth, and that was metaphoric and meant to be in nature. So it is about those failures or that change that can be fearful and has us act in ways that are self-serving and or very protectionary. I think some of that comes with working on projects and programs with each other, but I also think storytelling plays a really big part in helping us get past some of those, what others could perceive as failures, or we ourselves in our own spaces see as failures, or even trying to get through some of that healing. And I think storytelling is really something we focused on over the last decade, and utilizing creative culture bears and accessing artists and other folks to help us story share, not story tell, from perspectives of different cultures. And I think that can interface with some of what you were talking about, Janet, in terms of how do you get past some of those challenges or barriers to working together, to building relationships, is telling stories, telling authentic stories, sharing stories. That meets with resistance as well. That can meet with some other types of challenges that we've faced in rural communities. So another conversation, another webinar on that, but it is a utilization of story sharing can really help bridge some of that you're talking about, and getting in the kitchen together and cooking together, fixing something together, doing something together.
So Cheryl's comments remind me a little bit of a class that my colleague Stephen Cornell and I teach in our Indigenous governance program. And the class is called Making Change Happen. And it's basically a class about activism within Native communities and how to build capacity through Native nation building. And one of the things we talk about that nation building focused leaders have to do and community spirited leaders need to do. And again, this is not necessarily elected leaders. They're people within the community who have the ability to have connection and voice, is to really change that narrative about what failure or past mistakes or lethargy, for lack of a better term, were about. And so in a sense, the job of these leaders is to help generate that pathway toward change. And some folks we know are really good at that, and helping people sort of reinterpret that past in a more positive way to prepare them to move toward that different vision of the future. That's a leadership role that's shared across the community. And I think it's something that builds up through as these relationships develop, as trust develops, as community strength develops. So I do want to just emphasize that aspect of kind of change can be prepared for when communities have this greater capacity in focusing on where do we want to be, who do we want to be, and how does our past actually prepare for that? I wanted to pick up a little bit on what Lynette said, because I think there's an element of youth in this too.
Do it very quickly because we're about to go into the breakouts.
Absolutely. And that's
or
the
we
phrase.
Can say that for the breakout, but 30 seconds, Miriam.
Okay.
Seriously.
I think the challenge is to put a new memory in the minds of our children. And that's a borrowed phrase from an Indigenous leader in Canada. And I think that that is part of the challenge in not just Native communities, but rural communities. How do we put a new memory in the minds of our children so they can deal with change, so that they can move forward in a positive way, build relationships, and give us a thriving rural America?
Terrific. Thank you. And saying that change can be prepared for, I want to prepare us for change right now. First of all, by thanking all of these 5 amazing women, as well as David, and thanking the staff behind this, which is Devin Deaton of Aspen CSG and Tyler Bowders of Aspen CSG, who are doing all the. Devin's computer totally crashed in the middle of this, and none of you even noticed it, but he's back on, and that's delightful. So we're going to go into breakouts, which are totally optional. And the way we go into breakouts, Devin, are you going to tell us, or am I? Are you want to put the slide up? Devin?
I don't trust my slides, but go
Okay,
ahead. The link is into the chat.
Here's how it works, right? The link is in the chat, because we're in a Zoom, to just explain the technology to everyone, little teachable, learnable moment. We're in a Zoom webinar now, which can't have breakouts, but Zoom meetings can. So there's a Zoom meeting in the chat. You also got an email during this session that has that link in it. Just leave this meeting, go to that Zoom meeting. You will be able to choose. Tyler's going to bring up 5 different breakout rooms, 6, I think, 1 for each of us. Even I get a breakout room, and you get to choose the one you want to go to. So we thank everybody here today. We thank our partners, the Federal Reserve Board, RCAP, Rural LISC, the Housing Assistance Council, and my own organization, the Community Strategies Group. And so we look forward to seeing some of you in the breakouts in just a minute or 2. Thanks, everyone. I'm looking for the link.